So co-chairs, and I'll be chairing this lecture today. So I would like to welcome today's speaker, Philippa Woodcock, who is a historian of early modern history based at the Centre for History, the UHI Centre for History. She is going to be talking to us about French religious and physical landscapes of Maine and France, and she's taking in particular an interdisciplinary approach to this. So we'd be very interested in hearing how all the different strands of evidence meld together. And I think she will also be, as she's focusing primarily on France, she will also be drawing some comparisons with watery environments of the Highlands and Islands. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Philippa and let her get started on her lecture.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. I would say at the start that this is a paper which has been a very long time in the making. It has its origins in a postdoc which I did at Oxford Brookes from 2007 to 10, when I went to the very wet, modern-day French département of the Mayenne, Orne, and the Sarthe, which is an area which corresponds to the old government area of Maine. And when I was there, I documented their parish churches. I drove around 113 parish churches, taking pictures, trying to get inside and negotiating a lot of really dilapidated buildings. You can see there's an old representation of the area here. It's lightly forested. It's not particularly hilly, but there are various landscapes. This is the government of Maine, and that's more or less the same jurisdiction and same geography as the diocese. And just to put it on the map, it's around here today. So today we talk about the département. Back then it was the governments and the provinces. This postdoc which I performed was very much part of a comparative project, looking also at Schleswig and dioceses around Cambrai and Oxford. Various papers and publications resulted from this, but when I came north to Scotland, the research went into that doomed box for later, which means the death knell for research. I'm sure you've all got a box like that. Well, here we are, 2024, and I hope that by speaking to you today, I might benefit from your knowledge of the Highlands and perhaps find some new avenues for taking this forward. I'm going to focus on the relationship between the church, its landscapes, and watery environments, which seems very apt given this ceaseless winter of rain. My aims, of course, are mercenary. I'm going to try to pick your brains. Ideas don't have to be historic. I'll say now that I've got my eye out for interesting points about today's church too, and the environment and the relationship between the two. For example, what part does today's church play in the management of waterlogged environments which form part of or butt up against the church's jurisdiction? This might be especially interesting in today's context of the Great Church of Scotland sell-off, whereby the church is selling off 40% of its stock and some of its land. In contrast, it's a different physical situation in France. It's rare to find a church for sale in rural France, but the building stock, as I've said, is quite dilapidated, underused, and it's a big claim on the state, which became its owner in the early 20th century. So I think that large-scale sales are inevitable in France. So what will happen to the lands which the church managed, particularly when there are problems associated with the climate and management of water? To further thicken the plot, I'm working part-time for the next few months within the School of Divinity at St Andrews on their Sacred Landscapes project. This combines historical study of Fife's parish churches with analysis of the impact of the Church of Scotland upon the environment, and also questions of community resilience and social isolation in the light of the sale of churches. So if today I'm mainly talking about my past research, please bear in mind that I am following paths forward. So let's go back to the long period of Reformation and Catholic reform France, in deepest rural France. It really is around that area. During my period of focus, the religious character of the Diocese of Le Mans was relatively turbulent. It's not as bad as some areas of France, but there was the growth of a sizable Protestant or Huguenot community. There was sporadic religious violence in the French Wars of Religion, particularly when Le Mans itself was seized by the Protestants in the summer of 1562. But then there is a period of greater calm into the 17th century. There were mild efforts to encourage the Catholic Reformation under bishops such as Emery Marc de la Ferté and Philibert Emmanuel de Beaumanoir de Lavardin. During this period, was the Church's relationship with the landscape and environment as turbulent, or was it a more controlled situation? When I originally undertook the research, I was jealous that my colleague who worked on Schleswig, which has a very interesting geography, found so many exciting water-influenced parishes and significant water events in the early modern period. And I think there would be a parallel to the Highlands here. In Schleswig, it is evident that pastors and parishioners used water for their own purpose and expression. For example, there were major floods called the Great Man-Drinking Floods in 1634, which led to Schleswig pastors sermonizing that the floods were an admonition from a vengeful God for the sins of the people, and interiors of churches were painted to show Schleswig as part of Noah's flood. Popular expression of faith and watery occupations found its way into the churches. For example, here we can see ships, models of ships raised as votive items. They are cared for over the centuries, and you can really see the central significance of water in the lives of the parishioners. Weather events or acts of God also had a direct impact on worship. Devastating floodwaters could split island parishes in two, as happens in 1652 in Nordstrand. The little bit of the island down here, Pilvum, I'm sure my pronunciation is a little bit off there, became separated from the main island by rising sea levels. So a new church had to be built on the new island. Elsewhere, churches were built in Schleswig to adapt to the environment. Instead of a polished wooden floor, they would just lay down sand to absorb rising floodwaters. So in Schleswig, this is a period of Reformation in the strictest sense of the turn from Catholic to Protestant, but it is a visible physical reconfiguration of the religious landscape. I had to think a lot harder about my landlocked, but as you can see, river-bound diocese. It has no major ports, no coastlines, or devastating floods. I came to the conclusion that though there was a partial Catholic reformation of doctrine and practice, including attempts to root out some apocryphal beliefs, the Catholic Church in France had little interest in an attempt to reform the watery landscape. As in Alex Walsham's words for Britain and Ireland, there was no real interrogation or scrutiny of the once worshipped rivers, sources, and fountains. They were not attacked by Calvinists or Catholic reformers. Instead, water and religion are characterized by continuity, and water was really a point of stability for the church and parish. It was influential upon the parish church's jurisdiction, the practice of everyday religion, and popular beliefs. Indeed, the Council of Trent, which reformed many Catholic practices, nonetheless provided the baseline for this continuity by underlining the importance of water to sacramental life. For example, in baptism, it stated, "Unless a man be born again of water and the Holy Ghost, let him be anathema." In the Eucharist, where Christ's blood could be mixed with water, the peoples are called waters. The union of that faithful people with Christ their head is hereby represented. So water is really central to official belief. So I want to explore some of this continuity between belief and water today. It allows for social and religious control, but it's all situated in a world which is connected through the flow of the stream rather than the speeding motor car on the road. And we've rather lost sight of the importance of those waterways in the diocese now. So what kind of landscape are we talking about? As with much of Western France, this is a relatively flat area. There are swathes of vast flat fields with industrial farming, but equally in this diocese, they are very proud of small areas of upland hills. I mean, they're really about as high as Box Hill in the south of England, but they're very proudly touted craggy hills in the northwest are called the Alpes Moncel. They're really making a claim for this being quite an exceptional landscape. And for example, this one parish here, Saint-Léonard-des-Bois, is known for slate mining up in the hills. Locations within this parish reflect the importance of water intertwined with religion. For example, there is a farm called Le Déluge, the flood, and the stepping stones just here are known as Le Chapelet, the rosary. So there is a real exchange between religious beliefs and physical sites. Even if the diocese was divided arbitrarily into deaneries, you can just see the outlines of the subdivisions of the diocese here. It's really the five key rivers of the diocese: the Sarthe, the Mayenne, the Orne, the Rhine, and le Loire, which were its jurisdictional limits. And they were much more present physical boundaries than roads. Indeed, apart from 2 or 3 pilgrimage routes and the road north-south, Le Mont-Alençon, there wasn't really much in the way of a land infrastructure until the mid-18th century. So we can see the rivers here, the Sarthe, which flows down through Le Mans to Angers, joined by the Rhine at Le Mans, and together they become the Maine at Angers. It's a very, very short river which flows into La Loire. On the south of the diocese, there is Le Loire. I think that translates as something like a little dormouse of a river. And cutting through the centre here, we've got the Mayenne. And did I mention another one? No, I can't remember. I'm sorry. No, I think we've got all 5 there. So we've got the rough outline of the diocese here. There are other tributaries which play a part in the religious life: La Veuve, the widow, La Tanche, and La Vaison. And they are often responsible for creating rather peculiar shaped parish boundaries, as here at Saint-Sénéry-le-Géret. So nature again determines religious jurisdiction. The climate for an obvious south, well, I come from the southeast of England. I'm used to hot, long summers. When I lived in France, I was always told, "Oh, you'll be glad of the weather here." No, Normandy and Maine are wet for somebody like me. But as you travel south in the diocese, it does feel significantly warmer. And so the rivers would obviously have been very important for agriculture. However, of course, it would have been warmer at times, particularly in that late medieval period before the Little Ice Age. And there's evidence of this across the diocese in older maps where vineyards are marked quite far north. Now, they're still very evident in the south of the diocese, which produces a lovely wine called Janière, which was preferred by two such diverse characters as King Henry IV of France and the late Queen Mother. And I served it at my first wedding. It's a lovely, sweet white. The Tuffeau caves, limestone caves used to store these wines, were often rented from the parish church itself. And you can still see them down along the Le Loire at the south of the diocese. Oh, excuse me, that's gone a little bit too far. Apparently drinkable wine was produced around Le Mans, and you can still see terraces for grape cultivation as far north as around here, Fresnay-sur-Sarthe. But I warn you, it would be unwise to drink anything other than Janière from this diocese. Although, whoops, oh, we're going backwards. It's just, sorry, excuse me. There we are. Although respecting certain pictorial traditions, Louis Boudin's 1695 illustrations of the diocese show the period's ideal landscape as one where rivers, ponds, canals, mills, and waterways frame the villages, towns, and churches under the protection of noble heraldry. For example, here at Malicorne-sur-Sarthe, which was the birthplace of Bishop Lavardin, you can see a watery economic, religious, and political harmony. You can see his chateau and the church still has, now imagine the church is facing this battered old Peugeot 405, which is parked on a jetty which leads directly from the river into the church, which I imagine was built to allow stone blocks for its construction to be hauled up. There's the chateau today, and you can see everything is very close to the river. These ideal landscapes of Boudin propose a miniature paradise where religious and political authority are in harmony with a very tame and controlled environment. In some cases, in this perfect environment, we see the parish church seeking to bring water sources even more closely under its wing. They build around close water sources. For example, at Avezé, what was once the graveyard and now the car park, there is a drinking source immediately next to the church, and it would have been so in times gone by. You see everybody turn up with their 2-litre empty Coke bottles to fill up with this kind of holy water which is flowing forth. They also have the village lavoir, where you would go to wash your clothes, right next to the church. So there is control and provision of water sources for the parishioners by the church. In other places, there are examples of churches being built over ancient Roman baths and profiting from the flow of fresh water which was provided there. But you do often end up with a church being oriented northeast rather than west-east to take advantage of the old foundations, and perhaps the underfloor heating, maybe they fired that up. Elsewhere, religious structures were added directly next to rivers. For example, there may have been a main parish church, and they would add an additional chapel next to the river, perhaps to reflect parishioners' devotion to ancient water gods or nymphs. For example, at Saint-Cenery, a chapel was built right next to the river to allow girls to visit it, to wish to pray for a husband. So I suspect there was a mingling of ancient devotion there with more modern Christian beliefs. Further physical links between parish churches and the diocese waters exist in terms of their construction. The area is very geologically varied, and without good road transport, parish churches depended largely on local resources. So in the north of the diocese, you see churches rather like these rather grey, browny, red ones. They're constructed in flint and roussard, and their details are generally articulated in local grey and red granite. This series of churches of the north are called les Sœurs Romains. These are Romanesque sister churches, and it all looks a little bit dirty in comparison to what we see further south in, oh gosh, I'm going backwards again, further south in the diocese, where this beautiful tuffeau, this limestone, is more evident. And this is quarried in the Le Loire and La Loire Valley. And occasionally it glistens because it's got little bits of flint in it. The large abbey churches of the Sarthe Valley, especially those dependent on very rich abbeys in Le Mans, used this tuffeau as well. So you've got this really bright, sparkling stone. And they are linked by transport on the river, and they are also able to bring up beautiful marbles from the very south of the diocese at Solesmes and La Flèche. Occasionally in the south, you can see that some of the material from the north has been brought down to give decorative detail. This church, Saint Vincent du Larouet, is in the south, is in the Janière vignoble. And it's got both the northern roussard decorating it and the southern tuffeau here on this screen. Moreover, the position of the parish church and its chapels can also tell us something of the parish's original environment and the human management of the landscape. It's an agricultural area, but perhaps we forget how distinctly churches in the past marked the landscape, were built to be seen and to claim possession of the land. And in many cases, they were accessible by river. They dominated the few roads and were easily fortifiable. Their position can also indicate how past populations moved around the land. And generally, parish churches are built where they were needed. And in some cases, you can see two parish churches within the same parish when a population has moved to a new area. Some church sites, such as here at Saint-Léger-sur-Sarthe, were built on what was presumably once dry land. Now, this is the most beautiful honey stone village, which, if it were in the Cotswolds, every one of these buildings would be £3 million. Well, today there has been perhaps a lack of management of the Sarthe. This is on a dry day. On most winter days, the beautiful manor house will be underwater, as will the church. So there is very much a different watercourse. Perhaps there is a need to review the management by the church and the local authorities of the relationship between the church and the river, which flows nearby. So the environment and its management may have changed and water become more problematic. But back then, there was also a question of controlling water. On a daily basis, the river water was regarded by the king and the state as secular property, as his property, but it had to be regulated by a separate administration, les eaux et forêts de France, the waters and forests of France, a bit like a forestry commission. And it has lots and lots of officers, this administration. The parish church, though, had a role to play within this administration. During the French Wars of Religion, a lot of the officers of the waters and forests of France became suspected of having turned Protestant. And in order to keep their jobs, they had to prove that they were Catholic. And this faith had to be re-established by the local parish priest. So there were public oaths taken. For example, in April 1613, the priest of Saint-Pierre-sur-Haute was asked to inquire into the morals, the religious morals of Robert Favril, who was the local waters and forest officer. Why was it so key that they were Catholic, these officers? Well, given that water was key to the sacraments of baptism and the Mass, there was concern that Protestants should not sully the diocese waters with their profane touch. The church was also a participant in reform of the country's watery infrastructure. Here you can see the Mayenne at Laval. It's really a very large river by this point. Letters patent of Francis I of 1536-7 show initial attempts to regulate the River Mayenne, to make it more navigable, that it's got to be dredged to regulate the buildup of gravel and detritus at the bottom, and that the borders have to be maintained. This is all part of a move to boost the economy by making the rivers accessible, navigable, and open to the Atlantic eventually. Secular decrees like this, whether from local landowners or the government, would have been read at the parish church. Now, they might have been read from the pulpit, but more likely within this diocese, from the ballet. I mean, we would call this a parish church, but in this diocese, they're very, very proud of particular porches which have some seating within them. And they allow for such secular decrees to be read, yet was still within the church space. If these are not available, you sometimes still see these pierres à brailler. To me, I thought at first it was just an endless series of mounting blocks, but no, the local forest and waters officer would have mounted up there, and as everybody filed out of church, he would read these decrees about the management of the rivers. The church could also be a landowner, so would have been responsible for the maintenance of the river frontage, the chaussée, which is a kind of a towpath, any mills, fish enclosures, and locks. So here they are liable, just as any temporal owner, not to block the river with sand, gravel, or other detritus, and they have to maintain things at great expense. In most cases, this is not a particularly onerous corvée. As I've said, they're not really talking about formal embankments, as you can see in further illustrations by Boudin. It's just more of an upkeep of the riverbanks. Yet still there are attempts to wriggle out of this. This is typified by one case of the Benedictines at Château-Gontier, down to the south of the diocese, who in 1746 are drawn into a dispute with their neighbour, Monsieur de Combe, as to who was responsible for repairs on one stretch of the Mayenne, which was going to cost 3,500 livres. The complaint gets heard in local and then up to the top to the Paris Parlement. And the Benedictines, seeking the support of an anonymous official through Père Michel Morin, stated that there had been depositions placed against them over this matter by people with evil intentions towards us. They sought protection from the Paris Parliament to shelter them from all injustice in this matter. The affair drags on for several years with accusations of just whose meadow the river frontage might stand in. And rather profanely, when support for the Benedictines was not forthcoming, they hurled insinuations at Monsieur de Combe of suspect faith and atheism. Morin writes, I'm taking the liberty to enclose this letter to make you understand, Monsieur de Combe, that your religion was revealed at the moment you used the name of the Benedictines of Château-Gontier in your deposition. So The natural landscape could drag spiritual people into a very temporal realm. My final section really is to look at how the church relates to popular beliefs about water. And obviously there are residual attachments to the rivers of the diocese, but how does the church manage that and integrate it into official belief? Beyond the river as a physical barrier or infrastructure, water had to be carefully treated by the church and by parishioners alike. At this point, water is, of course, impossible to divorce from farming and survival, as a drought meant hardship and frozen water could damage crops and wipe out a harvest. In 1623, hail the size of chickens' eggs fell and damaged church buildings and the harvest across the diocese, which the church interprets as a punishment for wicked behaviour and particular residual support for Protestantism within the area. Abundant water represented a risk of unfortunate death for parishioners, with rivers in full winter spate carrying off unlucky individuals whose corpses might not be found for months on end. So it was inevitable that great hopes and fears surrounding the presence of nothing more and nothing less than just the right amount of water and at the right time existed. Although the parish priest had to console after accidental drownings in these great water events, there is also a sense of using water as a means to admonish and control behaviour, with the parish church here as an agent of the state. The priest was obliged to record all watery deaths, so he has to then liaise with official administration. But once he has done this, you often see little notations in the margins of parish registers saying that such a death is punishment for this person's bad behaviour, and sometimes ruined harvests are attributed to the evils which the justice of God inflicts upon us. The church did nothing to discourage the idea that water was also a dangerous demonic place, perhaps to keep people in the parish bounds. Don't cross the river. Perhaps maybe from better intentions by trying to protect them from the water, by filling it with scaly goblins. One such evil spirit, or, well, I don't know if she was quite evil, but who's very much represented in the area is Melusine. She's reputed to be the ancestress of half of Europe and is definitely a source of its mermaid legends. She's half woman, half fish. And although married to a noble seigneur of Bonnetable and living in this, well, an earlier version of this chateau, she's forced to take frequent baths each night or visit the rivers so that she can assume her natural shape. She's often present in the margins of the parish registers, idly doodled by priests. And whilst there is no Loch Ness monster, the Rhine River is said to be home to a monster, La Velue. She had survived the last biblical flood, but spent her time attacking cattle and had a bad habit of vomiting flames over harvested hay. On cold winter nights, she would haul herself out of the river to wander the streets of La Ferté-Bernard, which is a canal-bound town, where inhabitants reported she had the head of a crested serpent, the body of an enormous egg. She was covered in long green fur from which mortally poisonous spikes poked out, and her feet were those of a tortoise. She's kind of a malevolent and very wet Grinch by this description. La Velue is celebrated today in a village called Tuffet, but she kind of disappears by around 1700 from religious sources. Perhaps this is a result of better religious education or conformity, but she's still useful and still visible. And you can see how earlier presence in some of the parish churches along the Wien River can just about make out La Velue carved into the beams at the top here at Saint-Germain-de-la-Coudre. The church also used sites of exemplary Christian water. There are holy wells, such as here at La Fontaine Saint-Martin, a parish otherwise known for Daphne du Maurier's family. At the east end of the church, there's a stone which is covered over by this small tabernacle now, from out of which a source flows, and this source has been linked to Saint Martin of Tours and his companion Saint Demetrius as they passed through. Allegedly, Saint Martin, wishing to baptize local pagan forge workers, could only find muddy red tinted water, and he struck a rock here with his baton, and miraculously water flowed forth. To increase the power of this source, it was said that at the time a local pagan lord rode by, and he laughed at the event, but his horse, in order to show contempt for the water, trotted through it, and his horse's hoof got stuck to the rock, and there is still the imprint of a horseshoe on it. As a consequence of this action, the Lord obviously converted. My final section, and I'm aware I've only got a few minutes left, is to talk about one popular festivity which involves water. And this is, I'm just going to head back to Saint Vincent du Larouet. This festival, which I'm going to talk about, enforces social order through water. It insists on the entwined importance of riverine landscape and agricultural production. It's at the heart of the Janière vignoble, and the village develops around this quite splendid 11th century priory church. It's a very wealthy parish, the parish church in particular, because it is sustained by endowments of vineyards. You can see some of the wealth, obviously, in the external decoration. Incidentally, Saint Vincent, if you don't know, is the patron saint of winemakers. So what is evident on the outside is the wealth, but inside there are the faces of 92 of the parishioners who would have grown the vines and picked grapes. They were painted on the ceiling in 1634 in a campaign of redecoration after attacks by gendarmes. And this is really a unique instance in France of parishioner representation. And these are the faces of the participants in the ritual which drew together water, worshippers, and wine. It took place near the chateau known as l'étang de l'archevêque, the ponds of the archbishop, and involved the people, the Lord, who was the archbishop, and the priests. So on every Saint Vincent and on Saint Quasimodo, newly married couples were obliged to jump the stream called Les Roches, which was 2 meters wide, in the presence of the archbishop and the priest. On the same day, the seigneur stood above another stream on the way out of town, where the town's children were paddling in the water. After much ceremony, the archbishop would throw down a specific sort of pâtisserie to them, whilst the prior of Saint Vincent was on duty to provide 2 large jugs of wine. In turn, the parish then offered to the abbey of La Couture in Le Mans and the Juge Prévôt 4 pints of local wine each Palm Sunday. I'm not quite sure of the significance of this ritual, other than obviously celebrating the agricultural production. The bit about the married couples, I'm not sure, but we find it along Le Loire, the southern reaches of the diocese. So overall, I'd say that there's very little within this diocese that is extraordinarily or early modern. or even 17th century. Instead, there's an overwhelming sense of continuity of beliefs which revolve around water and the river landscape. This relative calm is echoed in other aspects of the diocese's religious life. So yes, there are sizable Huguenot populations and some religious upheaval, but it's nothing compared to elsewhere in France. There is some introduction of furniture like confessionals, which reflect Tridentine innovation, but this sits alongside more traditional things like statues which had been frowned upon by the Council of Trent. They didn't like images of a bald St. Paul or a goose-pecked St. Martin. Yes, there is some improvement of people's education, but really on a holy day, people like nothing better than jumping over rivers, or they even like taking their dogs into church. But the parish church was clearly part of the apparatus of policing the environment, whether through priests' involvement in the administration of oaths of Catholicity, the use of church space for government decrees, or in the perpetuation and celebration of popular beliefs, reinforcing social rules, freedom of movement and behaviour. A partner to the state, the parish church could also face demands for the upkeep of the state's property, including water, whilst its appearance, even if just decorative embellishment, depended on a world connected by the flow of the stream rather than road transport. So it's clear that there is no reformation of the French landscape, but whether Calvinist or Catholic, popular voices continued to influence parish life, which mingled religious expression with agricultural concerns, just as water mixed with wine to express the Christian communion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippa. That was a really fascinating lecture. Learned so much about water and water management in the early modern period in France. I'm sure we have some questions, so I'm going to open up now to the rest of the audience to see if we've got some questions, and you can just raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question and pop up. Okay, do we have any questions? Okay, Alex, over to you.
Hi, Philip. Sorry, my camera isn't working today, but thank you. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was excellent. And I'm just talked about these kind of long time periods, and I have a really a question. I don't know very much about this time period in France, but how about people traveling to church? Did they travel by water at all, or was it just by road about this point in time? I'm just thinking of my own time period, you know, much earlier when travel by water was really important. And a lot of the time, I think churches tend to be found by those locations because people did travel by boat there. But what about France? And also in particular, and in your time period, because this changes over time as well, of course.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can think of specific examples of particularly travelling by water, because of course they are encouraged to stay within their parish, which is defined in many cases by a watery boundary, and you are not to cross that ideally, or else you become potentially the burden of the next parish, and no parish wants that. What there is, though, is a sense that roads are problematic in this period. Roads are what make you vulnerable, whereas water is somehow protecting you. Roads are the way in which Protestant ideas might spread. Roads are the ways in which English soldiers participating in the French water religion, les méchants anglais, which there are constant references, might arrive in your parish. And those churches which are adjacent to the roads, yes, there is a sense that they were originally built to control and perhaps fortify a parish along that road, but they are also the objects of attack because they are easily accessible, whereas the river protects. So I haven't answered your question. It's just kind of a contrasting situation.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. And I see that Ian now has his hand up as well. Over to you, Ian.
Yeah, thanks very much, Philip. A really interesting talk indeed. In fact, it reminded me of work I was involved in many years ago around flood memories, and we actually got round to coining the term wateryscapes, which or using the term wateryscapes, which I'm not entirely keen on anymore. But I've kept kind of in contact with folks from that period, and I suppose this is more of an observation really than a question, therefore. And I was just wondering whether you've come across the work of Bryony McDonough from Hull, and the Centre for Water Cultures there, which she runs nowadays, and they, because they're kind of geographers, they work in more in a contemporary environment, but Bryony began work as her working life as an early modernist, and a lot of her work has been on custom and culture in a wet landscape, shall we say. Now, what I don't think they have considered, and what I don't think they are considering, there's also Hannah Worthen, Worthen. Hannah is one of the postdocs on that project. I don't think they've considered the role of the church in custom and popular culture, in relation to a wet environment, we might say. So it might be very worthwhile, if you're taking this forward, reaching out to Bryony and colleagues and seeing if there's, kind of any horrible word, but synergies there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the church as management of the manager of the environment. It's also the infrastructure, bridges. Often the church is paying for and maintaining. No, I will do. David just put up the relevant link, I think. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? If not, can I ask a question? I'll take my prerogative of chair to ask you a question. I did kind of have two questions, but I'll go with one of them. So of course the period that you're dealing with is just kind of in the middle of the little ice age. I think the climate probably gets worse subsequently. I'm not quite sure what the situation is in France, but do you find any evidence in your area of increasing worsening of climate and increased wateriness and so on, and if so, how does the church deal with that? Is it reflected in you kind of hinted at some of this, but is it reflected in the kind of sermons that they do? Is it reflected in their management? Is there a recognition that the climate is changing? So it's that kind of temporal depth I was interested in, I think.
Yes, you see it very much in the margins parish registers, which are being kept from the mid 16th century. The survival is pretty good for this diocese, and there is increasing astonishment. I think really from that series of bad harvests in the 1590s onwards, building up to that pre-revolutionary period, which was obviously known to be very, very difficult climatically, of what is happening to the harvest, the extreme weather events that they are experiencing are noted. I don't think, though, I have seen any evidence of them trying to understand why this is, but that, of course, it's just the parish priests doodling down in the registers. It is still being attributed to an act of God. It would be interesting to see what there is from secular authorities. There is a shift by the secular authorities in some aspects of land management. But whether that is in response to climate change or just state policy, for example, in parts of the south, there's a move away a little bit from the cultivation of grapes towards the planting of huge forests. It's known for its oak forests, but these were planted to produce reliable sources of oak for the French Navy. But obviously thinking that this was a good environment for it. But no, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of active involvement by the church in helping parishioners to navigate this changing environment. No.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
If we're sure we're finished, we will thank Philippa again for her really, really interesting talk, and thank you all for attending. The other thing I was going to say is that we do still have one further talk to come from the Silk Seminar Series this semester, and this is the postponed talk by Alex Sandmark and Shane MacLeod on People, Sea and Nature, Viking and Norse Navigation. And we're still trying to settle on the date for that, but we will update you as soon as we can get a date that works for everyone. So that'll be coming up this semester at some point, we hope. But otherwise, I'll thank you all again and let you get back to your afternoons.